pianists and teachers. Today we're talking about how to teach the Minuet in F major by Leopold Mozart. It sounds like this. This is a great example of what might be one of your students' first historical pieces, certainly one of their first minuets, and it is a piece that shows up in a lot of student books, such as beginning method books. I'm looking at it today in the Piano Adventures Lesson Book 3B, and it can also be found in another method that I use, the Alfred Premier Method Lesson Book 3, ironically also a purple cover. I think it's interesting to see where authors of methods place the same piece, if they use the same piece for what purpose. In the Piano Adventures book, it's used in the unit about octaves. And certainly we do have blocked octaves in the third line here. We also have broken octaves, such as measure 7. There's also a C octave. And then there's the minuet pattern, which we'll come back to in just a second, in measure 8 and 16, and that of course has an octave on the outside, which students might not think of as an octave, but it is still contained within that octave. If we haven't met before, my name is Jana Williamson. Welcome to my home piano studio in the suburbs of Chicago. I love talking here on my YouTube channel about intermediate historical repertoire, and I have a brand new resource for teachers. It's called Method to Masterworks, and it's a spreadsheet plus a training video that catalogs all these historical pieces like this Minuet by Leopold Mozart, where they can be found in various books, whether they be beginning method books or intermediate historical repertoire series. And the whole goal of this resource is to help you find the right transitional material for your students leaving a beginner piano method like Piano Adventures and moving into their intermediate study. So I hope you will check that out. Click the link in the description of this video, and I hope you will take a look at it. As I said, in this book, it's about the study of the octaves. If you look at the Alfred Premier book, in that book, they're talking about the key signature, scale, and chords of F major. Now, I think those are both great teaching points for this piece, and I would hope that any student studying this in the Piano Adventures book would be talking a lot about F major key signature, because they certainly have to play the B flats, as well as identifying what some of the chords are. And this piece in particular just sticks right around the primary chords that we use, 1, 4, and 5. So we're going to talk about that as well. Before I go into the chords, let's just review that minuet pattern, which I mentioned in my very last video. The minuet pattern is the tonic note and the dominant note, usually going down like this. Now, I just made up that name for it. You're welcome to use that name. There's nothing in music theory that says that that has to be called the minuet pattern, but that pattern shows up in just about every single minuet. And it's very helpful for students to not have to read, because those are bigger intervals, but just to say, oh, I see the minuet pattern there, starting on F. And then they know what to do. I always want my students to recognize patterns, to see scales within their repertoire and their regular triads and inversions, rather than reading everything note by note. Reading note, 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 note is extremely inefficient. So from the very beginning days of piano study, we look for patterns. That's why we learn theory and chords, so that we can find those things and learn repertoire much more quickly and efficiently and truly understand it, instead of it being a random assortment of notes printed on a page. All right, so let's talk about those chords. The primary chords in F major, 1, 4, and 5, would be F major, B flat major, and C major, or of course C7 for that dominant 7th chord. And we have all three of those partly in a blocked context and partly in this tiny little contrapuntal context in measure 7 and 8. So in measure 1 and 2, we have the F major chord, but students might miss that that's an F major triad, because instead of the C being down here on the left hand, built like a snowman, as we sometimes see our chords looking in pieces, the C has been moved into the right hand, displaced up an octave. It's still just an F major triad. And when we do theory at the piano with a grand staff, treble clef and bass clef, students do need to take into account everything vertically in both hands in order to identify harmonically what is going on. In measure 3 and 4, we have the B flat major chord, but again, they might miss that because in measures 2, in beats 2, 3, and 1 of measure 3 and 4, there's no F, right? It's just the third with an extra D, but that F happens on the downbeat. So if you played that all together, that's definitely a B flat major chord, that 4 chord. Again, we go back to 1, the tonic chord in 5 and 6. And then at the end, we have this brief counterpoint like this. That is a classic 1-6-4, meaning the F chord over C, 5 chord, C major, and then 1. If I played that kind of filling out that harmony, it might sound something like this. But it's done here just in single notes. You can still draw your students' attention to the fact that this is C, just missing the E, and F. 5, 1. So we have all of those main chords. I don't think that's beyond even a student at this level. In their late elementary, early intermediate study, they can certainly understand those 3 chords. If your student is having trouble understanding root position because maybe they've practiced this chord progression 100 times, then get out a magnet board and build the chords with magnets in their root position to see 1, 4, and 5, tonic, subdominant, and dominant, that the 4 chord is not in root position here, it's in root position here, right? And you can show them how that all works. So let's talk about the octaves. Like I said, in the Piano Adventures book, the topic that they're discussing here is octaves. And on the previous page, page 30, they have 2 little exercises about octaves, reminding the students of intervals that they learned up to this point, and then practicing blocked octaves. Now, it's definitely possible, especially for a good student who started at a young age and is a good practicer, that when you arrive at this piece, he or she cannot actually physically reach an octave comfortably. And I think it's perfectly fine to just omit one of the notes in measures 9 through 12 to allow them to still play this piece. It's definitely still worth playing. And they still have a broken octave in measure 7 and measure 15, and you can still identify the blocked octaves in that 3rd line. If you want for them to hear the blocked octaves, you can play that. They could play right hand, you could play left hand, and they can hear that full sound. Now, I personally like to omit the top note and just play that low C, because I think that gives a fuller sound with the lower note. And I actually have a student playing this right now, and he cannot comfortably reach the octave, so he is just playing the lowest C down there, and it works just fine. To briefly touch on articulation, I do actually really like the articulation that the Fabers have printed in this book. They have a 2-note slur on the downbeat to achieve this sound. Instead of making that detached, I don't think that gives as much of the natural dance-like lilt for the minuet feel, which should have just a little bit of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. It's not as grand and extreme as a waltz, which would come later in history and would be very fast and have much more emphasis on beat 1, but it still gives it that nice lilt to have just a little bit of that emphasis on beat 1. Another teaching point here, which we will find in all of these short dances, which students should play several of, is the binary form. Binary form is A with a repeat and then B with a repeat. But it's important to note that this one is probably technically what we might call rounded binary, in that the end of the A section and the end of the B section are the same. And hopefully in your initial discovery of this piece with your student, you have them look and see, oh, the 2nd line and the 4th line are the same, so I really only have 3 lines to learn in this piece. And that makes it a nice, quick, and easy learn. So what is tricky about this piece? Well, keeping in time can be very difficult, but it's so important in a dance, particularly a Baroque French court dance such as a minuet. And the real sticky spot is on the repeats or going from measure 8 to 9. What I always hear students come in and do is this. And granted, there is a pretty significant move at that point, so they do need to learn how to do that quickly. But I also think they do some sort of mental processing at the repeat sign and aren't thinking, I have to go right on. If you don't go right on, it completely breaks the dance rhythm and the lilt. So it should sound like this. Or if I'm going on to measure 9. So that means that students simply need to practice that transition many, many times. You can practice it hands separately to get each hand's, topography to know exactly where it's going to go. You can practice it slowly, but you have to call their attention to the fact that they are pausing there, because I have never taught this without a student pausing at the repeat signs. Now, for a student who has a good sense of pulse and rhythmic stability, you can do some metronome practice on this. This is about the level that I might actually introduce the metronome. I do not believe in using the metronome to create a student's sense of pulse. I don't think it can actually do that. But it can be an external help to show students if they are playing steadily or not. And with the student I mentioned who's currently working on this, I did just that with him. He has an excellent rhythmic sense. He's just really got a very good innate and developed sense of steady beat. And so we turned on the metronome and tried it, and his eyes got big, like, oh, I am not ready to go on to that next downbeat when I get there. Of course, if you do that, it should go without saying that it should start very slowly. So even if a student can play at this tempo, when you first put that metronome on to practice this transition, it needs to go much slower. Ready, and up. And you can kind of help them talk through it in the lesson and decide how you want to assign that for them. Do you want them to try metronome at home, or do you think for this particular student that's going to be too frustrating? That is a moment for individual decision around the student at hand. All right, I hope that gives you a few ideas on how to teach this very fun and very well-loved piece by Leopold Mozart, the father of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. If you have enjoyed this video, would you do me a favor and share it with a colleague or friend? Please check out the links in the description to this video, and I wish you all the best in your teaching.